So thanks everyone for being here. I'm pretty excited for this conversation. Having just worked closely both with Beth and Chris, and we have a lot of deep insights into this work. The other thing I would note is the questions from the audience were very thoughtful beforehand, so I think we're eager to open up the conversation to you all as soon as possible. So with that, I think the place to start is with you, Chris, is to talk about fair shots. Why did you write this book about a guaranteed income, and why did you do it in this moment?
Well, thanks Taylor, thanks Ruchi and the whole team for having us here. Super excited for the conversation tonight. If you guys can't hear me or Taylor or Beth, just I don't know, raise your hand or make a kerfuffle and we'll try to project more. For those who haven't read the book, which I assume is probably just about everybody since it came out 2 weeks ago, I tell my story, and through that, the story of the past 10, 15 years of my life and why I work on what I work on. So I grew up in a small town called Hickory, North Carolina. It's at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. And my mom was a public school teacher. My dad was a traveling paper salesman. And we had sort of a, bucolic middle class life. It was like what, my dad grew up in Mayberry, like literally or Mount Airy, North Carolina, the town that was the setting for the Andy Griffith show. And then I got financial aid to go to boarding school, and then later to go to Harvard. And there I met Mark Zuckerberg freshman year, and we roomed together sophomore year. And we started this little company called Facebook. And, the story has been well documented from there. But I write the book specifically to make the case that that the economic reward that I received from Facebook for 3 years worth of work was entirely disproportionate to the investment of the time that I put in. And specifically that my case, even though it's somewhat unique, it's not that uncommon. That we actually have created an economy that's creating a very small number of people who are very lucky, to use the word bluntly, while there are 99 other people who are working just as hard who aren't enjoying the same kind of economic opportunity. And at the same time, as we create that economy, I make the case that we have the power to change it, and specifically cash through the form of a guaranteed income can be the way to not just combat income inequality, but also provide stability in the gig economy of today, let alone what happens in 10 or 20 years with automation and artificial intelligence. So that's the reason I wrote the book.
So Beth, I really want to jump to you, and then we'll come back in. So you're working on universal basic income with the Y Combinator study. So if you could share a little more about what exactly it is and how you also came to this work, I think tying into your story as well.
Sure. Ironically, I didn't grow up all that far. I grew up in southwestern Virginia. So I work for Y Combinator Research, which is the nonprofit research organization that was founded by YC President Sam Altman. And Sam and I sort of came to this idea very differently. I think Sam is working with OpenAI, which is another nonprofit that he founded with Elon Musk, and is really looking at how technology is changing the future of work, and is really thinking about, okay, how do we address, sees a future in which so many jobs are going to be eliminated, and what happens? How do we address that? And he sort of came to the idea of basic income through that, and thought, this is interesting, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. So I think we should study this in a very real way. My background is an academic, is more in poverty research. I'm a social worker as well as researcher, and have been doing a lot of work with people in the existing safety net, and trying to help people navigate the system, and recognizing how the system is rigged in a similar way, but our existing systems don't make it easy for people to be economically mobile, or it's very prescriptive. You have to do this or that, and it's really difficult to do. And there's a lot of blaming and thinking about how people's lives would be different if they actually had the freedom to make the choices that a lot of the rest of us do. And so then, but there's, and I was actually started thinking about this with several colleagues as a more of a negative income tax model, which we can talk about later, but I saw a couple questions about that. But so then I think there is a lot of, there's a lot of talk about basic income. It's really popular. My Google alert goes off every day and they're really strong, like, this is the most amazing idea ever, we need to do it now, or like, this is the worst idea ever, it's gonna ruin our economy. There's not a lot of it, there is some evidence out there, but there is not a lot, especially in this current economy, like the current labor market context and the US context. And so I think what we're trying to do is we're planning a large randomized controlled trial, which essentially we're gonna randomly select 3,000 people in 2 different states, and some of them will be randomly assigned to receive $1,000 a month for 3 or 5 years. And then another, the other group that it's not going to be split quite 50-50, but will be part of our control group. So we'll have this sort of statistically identical groups of people, and we'll be able to compare outcomes for those that receive the basic income versus those that don't. And we're taking a very holistic look. I think there have been studies in the past very much focused on the formal labor market. Do people work fewer hours, and how does that affect? There was this fear that economic productivity was just going to, decline because people were going to work fewer hours. And we're taking a much more holistic view in terms of how this, looking at very much the individual level effects. We aren't doing a universal basic income study where we're, giving the money to everyone in an entire state or a city. I think that would be the next step, but we're sort of taking a foundational approach. Let's look at the individual and household level effects. At some community level, but in a different way of receiving a basic income. And we're looking at, certainly, financial health, time use, if people work fewer hours, work can be defined, as Chris talks about in his book, much more broadly than just, you work for minimum wage, or there's so many different types of productive activity. And so looking at that type of thing, we're looking at mental health and health, we're looking at child outcomes, pretty broad array of outcomes, and really trying to provide a data set that will not answer all of our questions about basic income, but begin to answer some of the questions about what a policy could look like. There isn't just one universal, it's not just one idea. Like, there's so many different ways that it can be designed, and there's different incentives built into all of that, and beginning to sort of think about what that could look like. So that's sort of what we're trying to do right now.
So I definitely want to get into what we do and don't know about the evidence, and then also, to your point, some of the different models, which I think is a topic that's not discussed enough, that like what exactly is a basic income or universal basic income or guaranteed income. But I also want to start maybe with taking a step back and also asking about like what is exactly is happening in our economy to why we feel the need to have this discussion now. And Beth, you talked about AI, and we've also talked about your motivation around some of the limitations of our current social safety net, which is one of the worst in the world. But one of the things that you do really eloquently in the book, Chris, is to talk about how your personal story relates to the changing forces in the economy. So I was wondering if you could just like walk us through those forces.
Yeah. So my view is, we talk a lot about UBI as something that we need because of the threat of artificial intelligence, and I worry that way in obscures what's already happening in the economy. So in my view, work and specifically jobs have already come apart in America. I mean, in the past 10 years, 94% of the jobs that we've created have been part-time, contract, or temporary. 94%. So nearly all the jobs are effectively the kind of gig economy jobs. They're not all Lyft drivers and Postmates delivery people, but many of them are the kinds of jobs where you only get 25 hours this week at Starbucks, and next week you're lucky if you get 10. And so what I think we know is happening is that jobs used to provide, like people would always say, oh, we need more jobs in America. We need, we need more good jobs, because that used to be synonymous with stability, right? That was 40 hours a week, paid, there was sick leave, vacation days, benefits much of the time. If you were lucky, retirement benefits. I mean, that's what my parents had. My dad, as I was saying, was a traveling paper salesman. He had all that stuff. My mom was a public school teacher. She had all that stuff. But all the jobs we're creating now are entirely, I think, are fundamentally unstable. So I view a guaranteed income, and specifically in the book, I make the case for $500 a month for people who make 50K or less. And I view it as a kind of income floor, which is really a supplement. No one can live off $6,000 a year. That's not it. That's not the expectation, but it's a kind of supplement to other sources of income, whether those be from the formal economy, from a full-time job, from the gig economy, from other safety net benefits. I think that it's cobbling those things together to provide a foundation is the place that we should start. And then, if many of the predictions are indeed true about technological unemployment at a enormous scale, then we have the down payment to invest in to create a larger kind of universal basic income. That feels to me to be what can respond to the income inequality and the changing economy of the changing dynamics of the economy today. And it's also eminently affordable. What I'm talking about in the book and in general, it costs about $290 billion. It's a lot of money, but it's a fraction of the cost of a UBI of $1,000 that would go to everyone today. So then, as the economy grows, as we have more abundance, as we have, Sam talks a lot often about the opportunities for so much wealth in the future. As the wealth is created, then we can have a conversation about certainly growing bigger, growing broader, thinking about it even more creatively. But we can't afford this today already, and I think we have a responsibility to talk about the problems of today, not just about where the world might be in 2030 or 2040.
So I want you guys to just in two statements say whether when you tell people you work on universal basic income or a guaranteed income, what their immediate negative reaction is, or what the thing they say was quickly. Beth, kick us off.
So I think one of them is that it's only, and I think Chris talks about this really well, that it's only about when AI takes all over all the jobs, and it's sort of like a basic income or work. Well, people should work. I think it's often talked about as an either or, but I think it's not at all. In fact, I think a guaranteed income actually helps people work in a lot of ways, and it does minimize the what people are facing now and the need for it now. So I think that's certainly one. Another, I think, is just this idea we're going to give people money for nothing, or people, even among people who are yes, we should give people freedom. They're well, we should probably have some sort of condition in there, they can't spend it on drugs, or there's always, even the most sort of open-minded always have there comes down this level of trust of how people are going to spend it, and that's problematic.
But in my world, it depends on who you're talking to. People in this, in rooms like this, I think there's a lot of curiosity, some skepticism, but a sense that this is one of the most promising ways forward. In fact, a lot of times, particularly in rooms like this, I hear a lot of people who talk about it as if it's a fait accompli. Well, of course we're going to have this. There's no question of it. And I think that actually sort of is a disservice to a lot of the work that needs to be done to get there. So that's one set of reactions. The other set of reactions that I would say, I talk about this with my dad, who's 87 years old and was born in the Great Depression and thinks about things differently, or if I talk about it with a Lyft driver or whomever, the initial response is just pure confusion. What are you talking about? People are just getting money. And where is it coming from? And how much is this? And when is it going to go away? And, money just doesn't grow on trees. And it's does Bill Gates get this? And why? Because he doesn't need it. So what? Anyway, there are just so many of these fundamental questions that I think what I found is that if you start from a different premise, if you start from the idea, as long as you're doing something for yourself, your family, or your community in America, you shouldn't live in poverty. Instead, starting from a social contract kind of, we're all in this together. If you are, working in some way, which effectively everyone, in my view, in America is, then we should make sure you shouldn't live in poverty. And what's more, you should have the economic opportunity to figure out what you want to do with your time and who you want to be. And so I know you asked for a brief response. It's not very brief. However, I do think that if you start from a different, in my conversations, if you tap into like this idea that we take care of one another, and that in a time of inequality and in some sense a lot of economic injustice, we have the capacity to actually provide for each other, then it's a totally different conversation than leading with cash from heaven.
Yeah, or the robots are going to come take your jobs.
Yeah,
Right. So you guys are both hinting at two pieces here. There's the part where people just don't believe that it's a good idea, right? And it's often based off of their beliefs of how people use the money, which is an evidence question. And there's the narrative question, right, which I think is also a political question. So put that aside for a second. We do want to focus a little bit on the evidence. And I don't think there's two people who know more about what evidence does and does not exist on this question than these two right here. So recognizing this in itself could be a 3-hour long conversation with you two. And would love to hear from you guys, and just to frame up for us, what do we know and not know about what comes from the evidence in terms of basic income. But I think I also want to broaden out to unconditional cash in general, right? Because we aren't just talking about the $1,000 a month UBI version. We are talking about cash interventions more broadly. And so, what do we know and what do we not know? Chris, you want to start on this one?
Sure. We might disagree a little bit on that. We'll see.
Disagree on the evidence?
Yeah. We know a lot, I think, about how effective cash is. We have a lot of information internationally. So there are several hundred studies internationally of small cash transfer programs and big ones alike. Small ones run by NGOs, big ones like Bolsa Familia, the nationwide program that they have in Brazil. They've been studied pretty rigorously, and we know somewhat consistently that when you provide people with money, their families are healthier, the kids stay in school longer, people are a little bit less stressed, and then in some studies there's evidence to show things like female empowerment indices go up. People are able to leave relationships that they don't like, or push the borders of what might be culturally acceptable in certain contexts. So I think there's a lot of evidence there, and I think there's a lot of evidence here in the US too. There's really 3 buckets for those who like to nerd out on the evidence stuff. The first is the experiments that were run in the 70s. So some of you may know there were a half a dozen experiments in New Jersey, Iowa, North Carolina, Seattle, Denver, and Gary, Indiana, where over 10,000 families got a guaranteed income. It was the last moment that this idea almost became real. It was an era when Nixon supported it, passed the House, failed in the Senate. It looked very, very promising. And there's a good amount of data that shows that people, for the most part, worked just as much as they did before. Young mothers took a little bit more time at home. People who were close to retirement age would retire slightly earlier. So there were some labor market effects, but they were modest. So that's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is what I would call real-time current experiments, so the permanent fund dividend that they have up in Alaska. Every citizen in Alaska, 700,000 people, gets $1,500 every fall. There's some evidence to know certainly what they feel about it, and there's some evidence about the effects it has. In that same bucket 2, the Eastern Band of Cherokee for decades have gotten dividends from the casino profits. Kids do better in school. They have fewer psychological disorders later in life. They're more likely to work later on as well. So there's a lot of evidence. And then finally, we have this thing called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which in the book I make the case that that's the framework that we should use to create a guaranteed income today. And it's the largest cash transfer program in the world. We move $70 billion every year to tens of millions of American families. It's called a tax credit. The way it's lived is a check. It's just money that millions of Americans get in the mail. It only comes once a year. It's not exactly a guaranteed income. It doesn't come every month. Isn't an identifiable amount. Isn't predictable. However, it's unconditional cash, and we know similar kinds of responses. So in my view, I think we've got a lot of evidence. We need more, by all means, But the challenge that keeps me up at night isn't more evidence. It's how are we going to change hearts and minds, which I know is probably something we probably want to talk about later. But so that's sort of how I think of the landscape.
And I agree that we have a lot of evidence. I think part of, so one thing is I think we have a lot of evidence that like this is correlated with this. We don't know as much about, and we do sort of have assumptions about the mechanisms. Like, okay, so like how does cash, yes, cash helps, but I think that there are understanding exactly what are the sort of intermediary factors. Is it stress? Is it like, what are those things and what constraints do people still face? Because I fear that everyone sort of sees this as a silver bullet and like you give people money and everything's going to be fine. And I think people still, there are a lot of there are a lot of other things, other challenges that people face, and sort of unpacking, what happens, what are the challenges people still face, what other changes would help people more effectively sort of capitalize on this or make decisions the way they would want to. And so I think, and that all sort of plays into how it's all designed and what comes out of it. And so I think one thing, I do agree completely, it should be enough evidence to say, yes, cash works. I think that one of the things we're thinking about is sort of not only those sort of unpacking those mechanisms, but then as part of the hearts and minds, I think a big thing is people are, well, that happens in Kenya, or like things aren't the same, or like that was a long time ago. And I think figuring out how to conduct a study that's rigorous, but that we also produce evidence in ways that can be used for that, because I think people will still say, oh, well, this isn't the case. But if we can, whether it's stories, I think that's a challenge, is sort of figuring out how to collect data in a way that's useful for that part of it, because I think there is quite a bit of evidence on cash. I am interested even breaking down, like the earned income tax credit is paid out in a lump sum. Now there have been some trials where it was paid out monthly, but I think the regularity of it could make a big difference. There's also a lot of, people that don't claim some of these, like the earned income tax credit, and sort of thinking through some of these, like I think there's certainly more we can learn, but I do agree that there should be enough evidence for people to say like this makes sense, we should do this. I don't necessarily think, we're there quite yet. And I think part of it is people not feeling as much like it's the other person that they're giving this to, and recognizing these are challenges we're all facing, and to whatever extent we can sort of bring these studies and contextualize them in people's lives, and it might make a little bit help understand, because people still don't understand what it is, or automatically the initial is like, no, we don't like this. This is anti-American. I hear that a lot.
So before we get to the hearts and minds stuff, because I know that's also where there's a lot of richness that often isn't talked about enough, this topic, I do want to talk about the design question, because that's a place that there's not a lot of nuance in the public debate or conversation around the design questions. And so Chris, this is something that I think is also unique in your book in comparison to a lot of books or commentary on UBIs. You go very deeply into this question of like why you designed it the way you did. So you can just kind of share a little bit around that, and then Beth, I'd love you to follow up, because one of the questions the audience had was like, why not a negative income tax? Which, as we know, the ITC came out of a failure of the negative income tax in the 1970s. So we'd love to follow you up about some of the research you've done as a Harvard researcher.
Well, I've been really marked by two things. One is how hard most Americans are trying to save, and how difficult it is. I mean, we all know the stats. Median wages haven't meaningfully budged in 40 years. Cost of living for the average middle class family is up by 30%. So that's just sort of like the, setting the table. The stories of how people try to save are just incredible. There's a woman that a friend writes about in one of her books who lived in the South, who was trying so hard to save that she specifically opened a savings account at a bank that had one and only one branch in a town that was a 45-minute drive from her house. So she went there, she opened an account, she put her $1,000 in, they gave her an ATM card, she said, thank you very much, she cut it up in the parking lot, and she drove home. And the reason that she did all of that was, she would say, because it created the friction to truly say it has to be an emergency. So, she would say, if one of her friends has a car that's broken down, she can say, I'm sorry, sorry friend, but like for me to go get you the money to pay for that, I gotta go drive all the way over to this town, I don't got the car, I gotta, in order just to make it, to create the friction, to make it easier for her to save. And I think those kinds of stories seem in some ways crazy, but they're entirely rational, right? Like it's specifically trying to create some kind of stability, some kind of foundation. Another story. So that's one thing that I've been really marked by. Another is the power of a modest size of money. So I was in a community meeting in outside of Cleveland last summer, and we had this group conversation of about 20 people, and everybody there was doing some kind of work, but nobody had financial security. I mean, everybody there was just trying to cobble it together. And I asked, we had a good discussion, but I asked a question to the group that a lot of people asked me. I said, how much of a difference would $100 a month in your life really make? It's just $100. And it was silent. Nobody wanted to speak up, and it got sort of awkward. And finally, this one woman, who's an African American woman probably in her late 30s, she looked me in the eye and she said, frankly, anybody who's asking that question has never had to choose at the end of the month between buying groceries and making rent. And she didn't say another sentence. She didn't say anything else. Nobody in the group said another word. It was just a clear and concise way to say $100 is a powerful amount of money in my life. It's not like I won the lottery, I'm gonna put up my feet, like play video, it's not, but it's a meaningful amount. Another person in another conversation in the same period also said to me, an extra $100, that's an extra 25 meals a month for me. And I was like, wait, what? 25 months? And he's like, yeah, I've got it pretty much down. My lunch costs about $4, depending on the day and depending on what I do. So an extra $100. So anyway, in the book, I talk about $500 a month, which is significantly more than the $100 I was asking about in that period. But I think a relatively modest amount of money for people who are really on the brink can have outsized consequences of providing a kind of basic stability that can open up different ways of thinking about the world and open up different horizons, and yet at the same time be affordable and be doable in the here and now today. So those are some of the values I think about with the design.
Yeah, I mean, some other things that pop out about design is how you think about work in it, and then also your choice to work through the earning income tax credit. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about those two pieces?
Yeah, the EITC is just massively popular historically. It's been around since 1975, and every president since Ford, on the right and the left, Republican and Democrat, has expanded it. It's like that one area of agreement between Paul Ryan and Barack Obama. Whenever they get together for the summit, and they used to get together for the summit, they would like come away and they would say, "Well, we disagree on all this stuff. The earned income tax credit, though, that's a place where we might agree." And consistently, historically, it's gotten expanded. So it's popular. It also doesn't throw people off of other benefits, which other ways of doing this are, I think, it's a big risk of doing it, and it's also very much part of the legal code now. So we don't need a lot of new bureaucracy to verify it. You don't need a lot of infrastructure around it. So my view is we should expand it and modernize it. So it's $500 through direct deposit or debit card every single month, paid for by income taxes on the 1%, specifically bringing taxes on income above $250,000 into line with where they were historically at about 50%. So I do think that EITC is important. It has historically been tied to work. It's the earned income tax credit. You've had to do something in the formal economy. I think I have a whole chapter in the book about expanding the definition of work to include all kinds of untraditional labor like childcare, elder care, education, which I think is really important. And it's no sleight of hand. It's like I'm very clear. I think effectively every American is trying to work in some way. This idea that there are all those people out there who are just hanging out, and this definition is going to be too narrow. Like, I think we should expand the definition to effectively encompass every American who is doing something for themselves, for their family, or their community. Yeah, the myth of the welfare queen or something, that people talk about is I think a myth. I don't think that exists. And the opportunity of tying it to work, I think, makes it much more conceptually sensible to the people who would most benefit.
And so, Beth, you worked on negative income tax. I'd also love to hear from both of you other models. What else is percolating in the sphere in terms of how to possibly go about this?
Well, I mean, one thing, so I definitely had not, there's definitely been this basic income group working. I didn't even pay that much attention. I didn't even not even heard all that much about basic income, even though working in this sphere. So I became interested in the idea, thinking through about the negative income tax and what that would look like. And was actually at first, so that is the model where basically we establish a floor, whatever, we peg it to some level, say we set it at the poverty level, just to say it, $12,000 a year for an individual. And then, there's some marginal tax rate. So as your earned income goes up, then the amount of your benefit decreases. So if you set it at, the poverty line and then it with a, 50% marginal tax rate, it wouldn't phase out, to much higher. And was just thinking through how, the existing system, some of the frustrations with helping clients, working within it, is that, especially for people that are on disability, a lot of them have disabilities that prevent them from working full time or being able to support themselves, but they could work fewer hours, but there's such strict limits. The moment you start working, you lose your benefit. And so I think one of the things that was interesting to me about the negative income tax was that it allowed people to build up. There were the same kind of cliffs weren't there. For some people who are receiving childcare assistance, childcare is really expensive, and if they earn an additional $1, they all of a sudden lose this benefit that could be worth $1,000 a month. And so figuring out ways, I think it keeps people, they're making very rational decisions to say okay, I'm not going to work this extra hour, or I'm not going to take this better job because it doesn't pay enough to afford childcare, but yet at the same time, it's a better job. And they're making very rational decisions. And so I think figuring out ways to sort of make it easier for people to pursue, to not have to take all these things into consideration, to have the benefits work more smoothly. So I was really sort of, when I first heard basic income was really actually opposed. I really thought that negative income tax was a much better model. And to some degree, a lot of people have talked to me and said, well, you can structure it in a way that it's presented as a universal benefit that everyone receives it, but essentially you're paying it back in taxes once you receive just a certain level. And that's sort of agnostic, because then it's sort of framed as this is, everyone's gets it, and it's sort of framed as this universal benefit by virtue of living here or being born, or how we define it. I don't have a really strong, I don't know where it would come out on that. I think it depends. There are a lot of different ways to frame it, but I think thinking about how it's designed, I think making sure that people, I think tying it to work. I don't know. I mean, it can be very broadly defined, but also I've learned that the administrative cost of some of our programs, the administrative cost of TANF, which is the sort of the only cash welfare besides the ITC, is it's 1/3 of it actually goes to people, 2/3 of it is administrative costs. And so figuring out ways to sort of give people more dignity and respect. But assuming that most people want to work, I think that these requirements, these conditions, the way that it's all framed is part of how this works, and whether it's viewed as a stigmatizing. I think stigma has a huge power over people, and if we, if there's any way that this can be designed in a way that reduces stigma, and this is something that we all could benefit from at different times in our lives and with different needs that we face. So this is not a personal failing. I think it really changes the narrative and the conversation about people in general. And so this is sort of a long, winding way. I don't know. I mean, there's so many different ways. There's so many different benefit levels. There's so many different ways that it could be what you pay for it. I think the incentives, whether it's paid for through income taxes or a wealth tax or all these things, all of it definitely affects the incentive structures and is really important to think about. It has to be, we can only test certain aspects this time, but I think all these things have to really be very intentional. And I think right now the conversation is very unidimensional, this idea, but not as much about breaking it down into all the different ways it can be designed. And I even had someone that was I was on a panel with someone who said that, this could really be a redistribution of not only income but power in a lot of ways, but it depends on who's designing it. It could also reinforce the existing structures and be set up in a way that actually doesn't change any of the structures. And so I think, it is really, the design aspects are really important.
Yeah, I would attack on just one thing that is we haven't said, but maybe it goes without saying or maybe it doesn't. Cash in particular is, I think, unlike any other intervention in that it recognizes the fundamental dignity of the individual to choose her own destiny, to choose what the individual wants to spend their time on. And it's not to say that education and healthcare and of course we need all of these things. I'm definitely not of the school of any of this stuff is a silver bullet, however you design it. But I am of the school that thinks even if you put the evidence, the empirical argument aside, just the moral argument, that everybody should have the autonomy to choose what they want to do with their time, where they want to invest, is why I think cash is so distinct and so unlike every other intervention that we have, because it is eminently, it's cash, it's fungible, it is what you make of it.
Well, I was just talking both about the small amounts, but also this point. We've done a small feasibility study, and one of the people was living in Oakland, and she was actually she was very low income, she had kids, a single mom. She was receiving a number of other benefits, from food stamps and Medicaid, and she was she was in our sort of control group. She was receiving $50 extra a month, and I sat down with her and we were talking, and this amount of money made a huge difference in her life. She didn't know that some people might have been receiving a little bit more, but she
20 times more.
Yes, but one of the things was that there was a job training program or a mentorship program in San Francisco. She lived in Oakland, that she heard about and she really wanted to do, but she didn't have, before she could never do it because she didn't have the money to get there on BART. Now the tuition was paid for because of, so it was a benefit, but the benefit did not also include transportation. And so we think about, she had, food stamps, she could buy food, she could buy this, she had a housing subsidy, but it doesn't, we try to think about everything we want to provide people, but then we realize that really, nothing, no benefits cover everything. There's always something else, and she was like, I was able to pay for BART to go to this, and then she got a job out of it, and I think even a little bit can make a huge difference, and with constraints so that you can spend it how you need to.
So you pointed out both the evidence case but also the moral case, but I think if there's anything we've learned about this political moment is that you may have the moral case and you may also have the evidence case, so that doesn't mean you actually politically win. And I think one of the biggest questions around the conversation around cash is that you're coming up against these deeply held cultural norms in America around work and deservedness that for in this country is very tied up in questions of race and gender. And so how should we think about this idea and the potential to move it both in the short term politically and also long term?
I think cynically, but I think talking about children is one way to start, because kids are born into a situation that they don't have, there's so much research showing about just that, this economic security from a young age and how that influences people's lives. And I think talking about that and how important, that's one thing that I just started thinking about more and more, that there seems to be support for helping level the playing field at that point. But that's a very, very specific thing. I don't even know.
I think we're undergoing a culture shift in the country, and I think a lot of it is generational. I think there's something about folks who, not just who are in their 20s and 30s, but who have a certain kind of optimistic outlook that there's a sense of mutual responsibility, that we take care of one another, and there's also a sense of idealism. We are so beaten up that we can't think big in our politics all the time, and I think whether you like it or not, Trump's election, was a wake-up call on the left and the right that the crazy shit can happen, And so I think that invited more people into this conversation from a different, from a much more hopeful perspective. But now we have to double down on that and figure out how do we amplify the stories of people who are who are, the story that you just told. I mean, how do we make sure that other people are hearing that so that they understand the power of it, and also think about how can we get started now. And we don't got to wait for federal policy in cities, like in the Y Combinator experiment. We have there's another demonstration that's happening in Stockton, California, which has a very entrepreneurial mayor who is leading it, Mayor Michael Tubbs. We're talking about doing it at a state level. There's so much that we can do to begin to build the case, just like we did with marriage. I mean, marriage equality is in some ways my favorite issue to compare this to. 20 years ago, the idea that gay people would be able to get married, yeah, it was sensical. People understood it, just like they might understand a guaranteed income. That's crazy. It just was so far out of the mainstream. And yes, we made some legal changes in states, but there was also an opportunity to, change hearts and minds by saying love is love. And we made immense progress very quickly. And there was also a generational cultural change. A lot of people who saw it this way grew older and began to vote. So, I don't know if it's going to be a 20-year cycle on this idea of economic security, but I know if we're not the people who are trying to start that, then nobody else is going to.
Just one other thing. So I think one of the things we're trying to be very intentional about, I was actually just talking to someone from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a more conservative think tank, who is talking about joining our advisory board, is to bring as many voices into the conversation and into the okay, here, what are the questions? What do you want to know? And bringing, to whatever extent we can see, not have this study, we're putting a lot of money and effort into this study and not have it be viewed immediately as this very partisan thing. And so I was, even talking to some people in the Obamas and EPA about how climate science data has been perceived and trying to figure, obviously we can't control it completely, but I think want to be very intentional about making sure that to whatever extent we can bring more people into the conversation and not have it just be, I think obviously when you get into nuances there's a lot of disagreement, but I think to what extent evidence can be perceived as sort of more neutral, if that's possible. But also sort of tying on up, one more thing, but tying into the sort of the cultural changes, I think more and more people are starting to realize, who grew up, for instance, in my public school, starting in based on second grade test scores, people started being divided into honors and academic, and it was completely separated, not even just for math class, but also for lunch, for gym, for everything. It was completely separate. And if you didn't make it into the third grade advanced class, and you couldn't take algebra in time to get into the this, you were very early on. And I think regardless of sort of ideology, a lot of my peers sort of in that environment recognize that that's not okay. I think more and more people are sort of seeing these structural things and seeing it as less of people try a lot of the sort of the systemic things that you talked about in your book too, are realizing that exists, and then I think that's part of it.
So we'll take some questions from the audience. I'll just call, raise your hand.
First of all, thanks so much for coming. We enjoyed the presentation. I'm curious how you guys think about the level of implementation. So when we talk about implementing UBI, are we talking about federal level, state level, municipality level, or should it be an entirely maybe private sector, foundation type initiative?
I definitely don't think foundation level. I think this, I would have argued before that definitely federal level, because before I started being more involved in these conversations, because there are a lot of areas that just simply couldn't afford it, whether they tax people more, there just isn't the money. I do think that there are cities and states that might be more likely to implement this first. But I definitely think it needs to be on a public sector level. I don't think that their philanthropy, it wouldn't be, even if they were able to do it in certain areas, there would be a lot of inequity there.
Yeah, I agree. Turns out cash is expensive. And the philanthropy, I totally agree with Beth. If you took all the money in the giving pledge that's been pledged, all of it, every single dollar, so assuming that people make good on the promise and then they give it all to one thing, just to cash in the United States, it would cover the guaranteed income that I talk about for 1 year and 1 year alone. So certainly not even a UBI, of $1,000 to everybody, but $500 to everybody making $50K or less. It would cover it for a year. So that's not to say that philanthropy isn't enormously powerful. If anything, I think philanthropy is a lot of talk on this issue. You think the amount of time that people spend talking about UBI, particularly in San Francisco, you'd think that there would be like money pouring in to, YC stuff and our work. And I think, I won't speak for you, but we have a good sizable chunk of a couple dozen donors who have said, yes, we're interested in building a bridge to the future on this. However, it does not line up with the hype, with the amount that Elon Musk and Richard Branson et al. Talk about. So I think there is a very important role for philanthropy to play, but it is as a catalyst. In the long term, the numbers, you have to change public policy because the numbers otherwise just don't add up on this, and I think on other issues too, but particularly on cash.
Thanks for all the work you guys are doing in this space, and this is kind of a tag-on question to the previous one, which is how do you guys think about the role of corporations in all of this, given that, if you think about nostalgically how people were lifers at companies and they got taken care of in certain ways, and nowadays corporate profits are at probably like an all-time high, more people are working at their contractor basis, so yeah, how do you think about that interacting with the plan that you have proposed?
I got all kinds of thoughts on this one. I think companies can and should play a role as a catalyst. I mean, Google is setting a high bar. Google.org is one of the few organizations that is literally investing money and time, attention, resources into thinking about the future of work and specifically how to provide a guaranteed income. And they're doing that as a company, which I think is very much under-recognized and undervalued. I think other companies should do the same. I think the leaders in those companies too should speak out about the responsibility that we all have to think about how to rebalance the economy and provide opportunity to the people who need it most. And I think we live in this time when Trump and what's going on in DC is doubling down on what I view as a debunked economic theory of trickle-down economics. I mean, it has been wonderful for corporations and corporate profits. It's buoyed them, but historically we've been, lowering rates for 40 years on corporations in 1%, and median wages have been flat while the cost of living has gone up. So whether your politics are you might agree or disagree, but my view is that, we now know, even the Wall Street Journal, the conservative newspaper, runs the headline that the biggest effect of the corporate tax cuts has been buybacks of stock, which is not the kind of investment in R&D or certainly the kind of things that are likely to create jobs and bring wages up and provide economic security. So I think corporations don't have a responsibility to buy back or invest the money as they see fit, but I do think the leaders of those corporations have a responsibility to say, hey, what's better for the economy in the long term, we know from studies, is spurring consumer spending to increase demand, to increase economic growth, not these kind of economic policies. So I think there's a lot of responsibility to go around.
And I think, so I've been spending a lot of time, we're fundraising for the study. And I think and I don't know, I think part of it's that the media narratives around things, we're doing a study, we're not out there saying this is the best way to do it. We want to fund this research study. And not only are we going to learn a lot, but we're also, it's 45 million plus is going directly to individuals. This is an investment in people and communities. And people are, are like, oh, I would really like to do that, but if by supporting it, it almost seems like I'm admitting that I'm putting people out of work, or I don't want to be tied to this idea. It's kind of out there, and it's true. Mark Zuckerberg said we should study this, and all of a sudden he's now the first name attached to an advocate. So I get there's this narrative, but I think it's frustrating from my perspective. It's I'm interested in this idea. I want to support it, but actually, I don't want to be the mission of, and I think it's challenging in this environment to sort of figure out that balance between sort of corporate responsibility and, you know, like how we're sort of moving this conversation forward, and whether the difference between advocacy and like the need to actually explore alternatives.
So one argument I've heard like against UBI is that if you give money to like basically everyone, that you end up like increasing the price of like basic goods that people need. And so as those prices go up, you basically end up in a situation where most people can buy basically the same amount of stuff that you get before. Is there any like data on whether that's true or not? And do you have any sense for like, is that true?
So, I mean, that's one of the first questions that comes up, and most economists say like, we're not fundamentally changing the amount of money that's in the economy. I mean, we've been, even quantitative easing, which put like $4 trillion, like basically printed money, did not noticeably affect inflation. I think that there could be, and I think the short answer is there's not a huge, there's not a lot of evidence on this other than things like Social Security did not lead to a massive inflation. So I think there is worry, especially around housing in places like this, that if everyone has an extra $1,000, then like landlords are going to raise it. I think that might be an example of like, well, you need to have some sort of something in place. But I think on the most part, it's not adding additional money. It's redistribution in a way that the Alaska Permanent Fund studies have shown that there's not inflation around the time of the EITC. A lot of people are getting a bunch of money back. There's not these inflationary pressures. So the study, Give Directly, is doing a long-term study in Kenya where they'll be randomizing it. They'll be giving this to an entire village, and you'll be able to learn a little bit more. But even if we gave it to everyone in the state of California, for example, we live in such an open economy. Like I buy half my stuff from Amazon sometimes, and that's not going to change the price. You know what I mean? So I think that's going to be hard to sort of get at in advance. Although I think most people, like most economists, say that it's not going to cause a big change.
Hi, thanks for sharing. I would like to know your view on conditional cash transfer. I noticed that a few examples you quoted just now regarding how powerful cash transfers are really conditional, like the one in Familia, the one in Brazil. So, do you think UBI is strictly better than conditional cash transfer? Do you think they coexist, or like are in the world that you imagine as an ideal world? Would there be like both CCT and UBI, or would UBI just be enough?
So there have actually been some fairly recent conditional cash transfer studies in the U.S. and that's been giving out smaller amounts of money. But the MDRC in New York City, New York City did one, and it's a family rewards project, and they also did it in Memphis as well. And the results, they were giving less money, but the results were somewhat disappointing. Like they didn't move things quite as much as they expected. And one of the things they found was that, well, there were a whole lot of conditions, first of all. So like it was for parents, and they were like they took the child to the doctor, they showed proof of that they could get this money, or there are all these like long list of things. So one of the things, it took a lot of bandwidth to do all those things. And people might have been taking their kid to the doctor, but they didn't remember that was a condition, and then they turned that in. And the people that got the most benefits already had a little bit more money, which showed that they already had sort of a little bit more bandwidth, or they had the bandwidth to do it. So I think, at least at the small level, it adds a lot of administrative costs, and it's not entirely clear that the benefits of it enormously outweigh that. I think some studies in developing countries have even shown just a prodding, saying like there's not like you don't have to prove that you support this, that you're like using this for education, but like this money is like could be used for education, shows that it often is used without actually, like I think there are a lot of resources to provide people, and I don't know. I mean, one things we could learn, but I do think that there is a huge administrative burden on both people trying to verify and people who are trying to prove that they did it, that there might be ways that are pretty much as effective, like on the whole, that are providing people the support they would need, and like this is things you could do without actually sort of making everything conditional. But
I agree. I would add on to that. I'm pretty skeptical of conditions. I was in one of our grantees is in Jackson, Mississippi, and we were down there 2 weeks ago talking to these moms who live in public housing, just hearing like what their life is like. Holy shit, the number of hoops that we ask them to jump through, the number of bureaucratic offices to go to qualify for SNAP, let alone TANF, for their housing vouchers, the kinds of things that they have to answer. You know, if their boyfriend moves in with them, then they get bumped out of their housing because that condition wasn't met. I mean, their marginal tax rates for some of the dollars that they earn can be as high as 60 or 70%. Which, you know, and I mean, these people are very rational economic actors. If you were to go work at Burger King for $7 an hour for 8 hours, it's $56. If you're going to lose $40 in benefits, and then you got to pay for gas and childcare and everything to make $16 to work on it. I mean, you know, there are so many hoops and conditions that we create already that I think adding more conditions is often, you know, at odds with the goals. The one place where I think sometimes it might make sense is when the condition is effectively universal. So I think the best example is in Mexico. And initially in the program called Oportunidades, it was, you know, effectively a cash transfer to every kid in the country, as long as the parents made sure their kids were enrolled in school. Now, it just so happens that 99% of kids in Mexico were already enrolled in school, you know, or it might have been 96%, I don't know the exact number. But like the point is, you know, and there were some vaccination requirements, I think, in that one too. But the point is like, I think at some moments it is more sensical to people if it's like, yeah, you know, it's like a school stipend and it's more of a symbiotic kind of relationship. I make sure my kid's in school and so the state supports me with a small amount of cash, etc. Then in some cases I think conditions can make conceptual sense, but I think, you know, more often than not, they're somewhat cynical ways to control behavior.
I got a couple of questions actually.
We're short on time, so maybe limit to one.
They're like 1.5 then?
I'll take that.
Thanks for doing this, by the way. But what messages, so when you talk about this with conservatives, like what messages resonate with them? And for marriage equality, like was there a tipping point number of supporters for marriage equality when it really started to pick up in pace? And are you measuring a similar number of supporters for UBI and how fast is that moving around?
I'll let you answer the second part. The first, so my experience, and when a lot of people talk about basic income, they say this has like support across the political spectrum. When like you get down to the details, that sort of falls apart pretty quickly. But I think that one thing is appealing to certain, I would say the more libertarian side is that the freedom. Like people actually know how to make decisions for themselves. It's more efficient. It's, you know, people, especially people who favor smaller government, like I would rather than food stamps, I would just rather give people cash. It, you know, makes things different. I think it depends on who you're talking to and conservatives as well. I think there are people who would say like, yeah, let's do this, but let's set it at a level that is, you know, would replace every other benefit, and then that completely changes, you know, it's not enough at all. And so it sort of, in some ways, it kind of breaks the support for the idea sort of breaks down, could break down quickly, but I think that could change. I think I do see, you know, a future in which, especially as people get more used to the idea and more evidence, I'm hopeful, cautiously.
And on the marriage front, you know, we made progress in several states and didn't cross the 50% threshold until really like 2009, 2010, and then it dipped back below after some progress was made, and now it's back above 50%. But you know, I think we've got to be careful with public opinion on this issue in general. Like if we're just led by our polling, you know, support for UBI is well below 50% in the United States. Support for the idea that if you work, you shouldn't live in poverty, I mean, is near unanimous. So I do think this is where the way we talk about this does matter a lot. But we also, you know, I think we have to be led by the strength of our convictions on this issue. That I think people should have basic financial stability, and cash is the tool to provide for that. And that's a values-based thing, and I think we need to make that case consistently as a as a movement in order to lead on it and be, of course, attentive to where public opinion is and where other folks are, but also realize that this is that we have to develop some momentum here. This is not going to be like it's not on the agenda for 2019 social policy in Washington D.C. It may be in 2021, but we got a lot of work to do to get there. More likely later in 2021. We'll see.
So we're out of time, and so I want to wrap up with a kind of two-parter question for both of you. So the first is, you guys have been in the zeitgeist of this now for longer than most people, and so I'm curious to hear from you, like, what are you most hopeful about? And then I'd love to also hear from you for folks who want to plug into this work, want to be supportive of it, want to help further the cause. How do they do that? Beth, you want to go first?
Sure. In terms of being, I started working on this, I guess, in like May, June 2016, and have been very surprised by just how, like, in that time, it's moved, like, more towards, like, more people know about it. It's less, like, that's the most radical thing I've ever heard. Like, we have a long way to go, but I think being just in conversations with people, I've talked to people, some from some like very traditional foundations. Like when I first started, they were, oh, this is way out there, and then a year later, actually, I'm hearing a lot about this. Like I think we might want to be involved in this, and so I think there is more openness to the idea and recognition that like maybe not everyone's on board to support it, but the idea of like we need to learn more about this and we need to think more about this, which leads me to sort of just hopeful in general, because that's a really short amount of time and we haven't. Not a lot has changed. And in terms of support, we are, even a couple of conversations beforehand, like there's a lot of sort of work that we're doing in terms of data collection and, people have technical skills or want to volunteer. We're also actively fundraising. This total study cost is $60 million. And we are, we're making progress, but we're still fundraising. So if you have whether it's contacts at foundations or individuals that might be interested, I'd love to connect and talk more about, trying to sort of broaden our circle of people that we're reaching out to. Really want to get as many stakeholders involved as we can.
And I would say, I'm most hopeful. I feel like we live at a moment when it's okay to think crazy. As much as I think Trump has been, on balance, destructive to the country and civil discourse and could be even worse. I do think that, people feel emboldened to think boldly. Emboldened to think boldly, emboldened to think big, another B word. But, and so I am really hopeful about that, and that we can do that in a way that also translates, that doesn't, that translates into how we can get things done in the short term. And in terms of what people can do, economic security projects is, so Y Combinator is running like the gold standard of the pilot, that cost $60 million. That what year do we expect to have results?
So we're hoping to start later this year. So the full study will run for 5 years. We'll have most people will get it for 3 though, so I would say, it'll be at least 3 to 4 years before we'll have,
So in 2022, 2023, we'll have like gold standard results that will be, unparalleled in, not just in the United States, but really globally. Like anybody who's talking about Finland and Kenya is missing the action on what's happening in the U.S. I think in the meantime, the group that I co-chair, Economic Security Project, is what we're trying to do is research, politics, and movement building to get the conversation going. Research on how do we get this done, how much is it going to cost, what are the different ways of paying for it, politics on how can we start at a state level, how can we get legislatures involved, and movement building is in how do we get the communications, how do we get people not just in rooms like this one talking about it, but in places like Hickory, North Carolina, where I grew up, and this is not, the agenda item of the day. So, we're building a network of people who are really interested. So we'd love to talk to people who have all kinds of skills, who have all kinds of resources to bring to the table, because we have so much work to do.
Thank you both so much. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure you guys will be open for people to come up and chat a little bit afterwards. Sure. Okay. All right. Please join me. Thank you.
Woo.